This week's podcast explores how modern longevity presents both an unprecedented opportunity and a cultural challenge. Living longer doesn't guarantee living better. Jonathan and I work together to reframe the second half of life as a deliberate act of design, not default, and challenge the cultural obsession with productivity to make space for purpose, flourishing, and connection. But first, let's get to know Jonathan a little bit. Jonathan Ainsley is a longevity strategist, a coach and speaker who helps individuals, families, and organizations rethink what it means to live well across a longer lifespan. After 4 decades in financial services in the UK and the US, including leadership roles with Schwab, Merrill Lynch, and Advisor Impact, Jonathan turned his focus to what he calls longevity by design, not by default. Through workshops, keynote talks, and his longevity planning platform, he guides people to build flourishing lives by intentionally designing their second half, integrating mindset, health, community, purpose, and the ever-important financial readiness. His work draws on research from Blue Zones, Gallup's Strengths methodology, and Harvard's Flourishing framework, creating a structured yet deeply human approach to aging well. Jonathan's mission is to disrupt outdated retirement narratives and replace them with a powerful new model, seeing 60 to 100 as the true performance window of life, not as a wind down. His work has resonated with advisors like me, retirees, corporate leaders, and young adults alike, and obviously, it's sparking a conversation that changes how people imagine their future. Jonathan Ainsley, welcome to the Flourish Feed Podcast.
Thank you, Gillian. I'm very excited to be here.
Wonderful. Now, this word that I've now started to call the dirty word, retirement, and I've really formally tried to replace it in my language with the word longevity. This is a model that was designed nearly a century ago, and it comes down to a waiting for the end definition. It's a phase of life that has to do with the concept of death itself. But in your work, you talk about the difference between living to 100 by default versus living to 100 by design. What does default aging look like in today's world, and what does your version of aging look like?
Well, it's interesting, Gillian, the way I've stumbled into this, and stumbled is the operative word. So my work at Merrill Lynch for 7 years in the field working with advisors, the longevity focus really kicked off with the question around, well, where's the value of the human advisor in the face of technology, the robos, etc.? Merrill actually did a pretty good job. They did a webinar, for instance, on Are You Ready to Live to 100? And in working with teams, the general refrain was, well, we plan clients to 95 or 100, and they all say, that's not going to be me. I don't want to be old and decrepit. And it's very consistent. But it also reminded me that I think for most of us, we don't have to look very far in today's world to realize that many are living far longer than they expected. So at a personal level, my grandmother spent pretty much 30 years promising me each year would be her last because she was too old and frail to go on. Made it to just shy of 101. My uncle here in central Florida was wired to hit the golf course at age 65, did so, and then got bored senseless playing golf 4 times a week, generally sloshed by lunchtime for 25 years. And then my father, to sort of pop it on the head, he used to sort of talk about how life beyond 70 was more about time filling rather than any sense of purpose. So this whole idea, when you sort of step back, my presentations now, I will start by making that statement, we don't have to look very far, but then I'll ask people to put their hand up if they've got a family member who's made it to at least 80, even if they're not still alive. And these days, literally every hand goes up. And I get people to look around the room. What about 90? What about 100? But then I pivot it by saying it's probably fair to say that most of them did not set out at an earlier age with the intention of living so long. They did it more by default rather than by design. What happens when we bring intention into reframing and redefining what does it mean to successfully age?
Absolutely. And that really is the difference between this idea of it being a passive journey as opposed to an experience that is based around intention. But if you're going to have intention, you've got to have examples to work from. And I think that when I spoke with Dr. Joseph Kovlin a few weeks ago, and we began to discuss this concept of retirement basically being a myth and old age being made up, We talked about the fact that there aren't really great examples of what it is we're supposed to do in that period of time that is wrapped around intention. It's rather more one of a passive type experience. So in your experience working with successful longevity, let's call them experts, people who are truly living the way that you're talking about, what are some of the rituals that we can call our own, or how should we look for those based on who we are and maybe what we did with our life?
Well, Gillian, it's so fascinating because there is a lot of work going on out there. And so you mentioned Dr. Joe Coughlin. One of my favorites is Ellen Langer, who was the first female at the psychology department in Harvard. And her experiment in the 70s, where they put a bunch of old guys in a resort for a week. And as she reports, and you can go check it out on YouTube, there's lots of interviews that she's done. And she speaks of how when they turned up, she took a look at them and thought, gosh, some of them may not last a day, let alone a week. But then typically when their caregivers departed, typically their daughters, they got them doing things they weren't used to doing. So carrying their bags and things like that. So within a week, they're moving better, they're seeing better, they're hearing better. And as she says, that the idea of coddling, so this sort of low expectations that we sort of wrap around people as they age, that then builds into sort of other areas where we are more capable than we think. But, well, that's wrong. We're not more capable than we think. We are more capable than we allow ourselves to think. So I like to frame it, we're infinite beings handicapped by our limiting beliefs. And since there isn't this framework of successful aging in place, yes, you have anomalies. So what I mean by that, I was seeing a YouTube a few weeks ago of a 103-year-old who he didn't use any walking stick and didn't take medication. So my question was, well, what have I got to do to arrive there like that?
Right.
And this isn't about living forever. I don't go talking about pushing products, things like that. But there are commonalities. So you mentioned blue zones pop up all over in the sort of longevity space. So what we typically focus on now is mindset, physical health, metabolic health, purpose and fulfillment. So you can be busy, but do you feel fulfilled? The importance of having the right people around you, so your connections, your community, and then financial education and financial fitness. And I just want to come back to something you said. Aging at the moment, or historically, has been a reactive experience. So, when you build into that only 2.5% of healthcare expenditure in the Western world is on preventative, the main framework beyond 65 or thereabouts is reacting to things. And, in the US, it's 12.4 years of chronic illness is just the average. So, talk about fertile ground to really, change how we see things. And, that's the cusp of what we're doing here is reframing and redefining, well, what does it mean to successfully age?
It is a marvelous conversation. And ever since I first met you a while back, it's changed the way that I have most conversations with clients. And that number that you just threw out there, 2.5% of our dollars are spent on preventative when it comes to our health care. Is that what it was? Healthcare, right? I mean, that there is an exact example of something I want to fix, something I want to change, because you're starting to get to know me. But if you've known me for a long time, you know that I truly believe that when I invest in my gym, or I invest in my sauna, or I invest in my cold plunge, I'm investing in healthcare. But that's all proactive, preventative healthcare. I think our model as a society, and even the society that we define retirement by, is one where you only spend when something starts to fall off, right? You don't spend up front. But all of this upfront thinking is where the design concept comes in. So when it comes to this idea of, age 20 to 60 being the warm up, and then age 60 to 100 being the performance window, that's an idea that really has blown my mind from you lately as well, because I'm just about to reach the halftime of life here, and I love the feeling that I now can hold myself upright and tall and proud and say, I have done these things. I've gathered all of these nuggets of wisdom and ability, and now I want to reach my full expression. And I may be a bit of an outlier in saying it that way, but if I can demonstrate that over the next 50 years, then this will be a life well lived. So how does one begin the process of looking at oneself and designing that performance window?
Well, it's been a fascinating journey for me as well, Gillian. So putting these workshops together when I was at Merrill, it ended up last year where I was the keynote speaker for the Florida Council on Aging's annual conference. And I had the state director of AARP comment, Jonathan's program shifts mindsets from ones of fear and frailty to ones of opportunity and promise. So when I put the workshop together initially, the idea was to sort of solicit feedback from clients, from the advisor's clients, really on this topic of longevity. Look, it's a big deal. We need to get our arms around it more. Will you come and give some feedback? And when one of the teams said, well, will you put it together? I set out by thinking, well, okay, how do we do this? Because generally the idea of let's talk about your aging is where met with, yeah, let's not and say we did.
Yes.
So creating a safe space. And I sort of stumbled into it because we pretty much run the same workshop 8 years later because of the reaction, this environment that it creates of shifting mindsets, creating paradigm shifts, and the feedback I get from these things, whether it's the advisor saying, I've known these people a long time, I saw their being shift in front of me. A financial planner of 30 years bringing a client of 22 years who'd never given her a referral, and she got 4 referrals because of the workshop. But then you pivot into the client experience, and when you get people talking things like, you're unlocking my bigger view on life, a 24-year-old saying, this is amazing. And then I think most tellingly, coming back to the sort of the 60 watershed, in the villages, the second workshop I did, one of the top places for aging in the US, I had a 65-year-old write at the end of it, this workshop shows you it's about the next 40 years, not just about the dollars.
Right.
How many 65-year-old men or women are thinking about the possibility of what the next 40 years might be? And that's where the shift occurs. You go from the 65 plus, as I call it, of just adding uncertainty. And if you think of the old model, if you wanted longer retirement, you sought to retire early. Whereas once you start opening up to the possibility of, whoa, I could have 40 years to go, now what? Mm-hmm. And that flows back into your comments of when you sort of do an evaluation of self, how much better are we at age 60 with all our life experiences, no matter what they are, versus where we were at 20. So I may not go and run another 3-hour marathon, but once my mindset shifts to say, okay, what could I go and do? What could I accomplish over the next 40 years? The landscape changes. And
it sure does.
Changes.
And by necessity, I think we as advisors, or myself as advisors and my brothers and sisters in crime in the advisor space, what we really need to do is we need to shift the definition of work from the old way, because retirement itself is a function of you get to stop working at a job that you don't necessarily love or that physically taxes you. We need to shift that definition of work to something that is more play-based or more joy-based, but we also need to shift the definition of what exactly we're planning with and the questions required to open up the imagination, to re-tap into who that person was when they started the journey at 20, because that's probably where the fire exists to determine how we want to invest our time between 60 and 100. So what are some of the ways that you get people fired up about that gets them out of the mindset of aging and decline and into the mindset of not starting over, but starting better?
Well, I love the way you segued into that, referencing the 20s, because, as I've already mentioned, the original workshop was really to sort of get people to come and engage, which obviously they then did. But then they came back and said, well, okay, we want more. Well, what do you want more on? And the answer was purpose. And there's a lot of stuff on purpose out there. As I've already mentioned, to me, purpose goes with fulfillment, because fulfillment is experiencing purpose. But if we're going to look at, well, okay, what are you going to do that fulfills purpose over the next, 30 or 40 years? I stopped to think, well, how do we create the second workshop? And I thought, if we look at humans a little bit like computers, we're born with a natural operating system, me 1.0 as I call it. But then early on in life, we take on the malware or the ego, So if we're going to be sitting down and looking at purpose, who's driving the bus? So the pre-work for the second workshop, and we call it Natural Essence, Living Younger, Longer with Purpose and Passion, is to sit down, shut your eyes, take some deep breaths, picture yourself as a small child at play, and then come up with a word that describes that child at play. So when I get them into the workshop, did you identify that word? And then out of 10, how much has that word been present in your life since? So if you've lived your purpose or your passion, great. If you haven't, which I think is the case for many, well, let's reconnect there. And again, just because you've done a job, and I think it's important to distinguish that 20 to 60 time frame. You may have been deemed successful financially, you may have had social status. I've made it a habit of asking advisors over the last sort of 8 years, what level of joy do you feel your clients experience, including high net worth individuals? What level of joy do you feel they experience on a daily basis if 10 is high? And the average has been a 4.
Wow.
So again, this idea, I think there's plenty of room to go around for everyone to find a greater level of joy through being more intentional.
And we think that level of joy is going to come from, you don't have to go to work tomorrow. You get to sleep in for a month of Sundays. You get to have ice cream anytime you want and go on trips and go shopping and go to whatever it is that your definition is. But that isn't purpose, right? That's not going to give you what got you through when you were feeling a level 4 joy, but you still got up and did it every day. Now we have this beautiful blank canvas to increase the level 4 joy to something higher and make it truly about ourselves with the means that we've created for ourselves. So that sounds like a pretty great place to be. Why do you think, if there is a resistance to it, is it that we just don't have leaders and guides to take us down that road? Or is there a resistance to it because the definition of retirement is grandkids and cruises? Where's the resistance? Well, you must have heard some resistance along the way.
Absolutely. And I think, to break that out into 2 levels. So let's look at this sort of at the bigger picture, the corporate sort of thing. And in the advisory world, there's a lot of focus on mergers and acquisitions. You hear about the $84 trillion wealth transfer that's coming. AI, a lot of investment into AI, but where's the coaching of the human advice? How are we focusing on helping advisors raise their game to transition from the traditional model to, I liken it to sort of going from a Nokia handset, 20 years ago and debating, do we get Nokia or Motorola? And around the corner comes iPhone. And longevity planning is the iPhone. So the idea of providing training, which is, again, some of the feedback I got early on is, hey, Jonathan, no one's training us. But it's also then peeling the C-suite folks away from sort of looking at numbers and the challenges they're facing, the headwinds, because this unlocks the door to being a force multiplier because of the impact that it ultimately has on the client. So it addresses all the challenges at the corporate level. I think at the personal level, fear is a predominant thing, and that maps into advisors as well. They've been trained to go and do something, and let me show you, the idea of, here's a Monte Carlo simulation, and, we can all talk about that and smile at each other and pretend that we all know what we're talking about. And that's the safe space my experience shows me for many an advisor. And the idea of, you want me to do what? And that's the idea of creating a program, a training program that gets them through to this different level of competency of, wow, that was easy. And, I've had a portfolio manager, for instance, saying, I've always hidden behind the numbers. Now I don't have to. I can meet the clients where it's important to them. And I've even talked to FINRA where they then pivoting towards the clients being longevity illiterate.
Yes.
So simply asking a client, well, what do you want to do now? I actually presented last week at an elder law symposium. And it was fascinating because I didn't know that much about, well, what really constitutes elder law? What do you get up to beyond estate planning? And the lawyer, the attorney said to me, well, we ask clients, how they want to age. And I looked at her, I smirked and I said, well, okay, how does that go? And she said, they haven't got a clue. And so you've then got at the individual level, and one of the things the Florida Council on Aging very focused on, and they sort of recognized with the work we're doing, is addressing ageism at the individual level. Because that inner voice that we have, the limiting beliefs that we can have, that then impacts, again, if we're bringing that into how we see the future, because again, it's fear-based. I don't want to be old and decrepit, so I'm going to play as though I'm going to be there early, sort of thing. So when you get people saying, gosh, you're unlocking my bigger view on life, what does it look like for advisors if they're actually getting their clients excited for the future?
Absolutely.
How many advisors are really unlocking that bigger picture? And the clients need that help, because the complexity of 30 or 40 years beyond 65 is going to require a much greater in-depth analysis and understanding beyond a Monte Carlo simulation to 95. So, we've got to help the individual. And one of the neat things, Gillian, about all of this is the biggest breakthroughs I've seen are the clients who in a workshop may put up a sort of a brick wall and resistance and sort of leave me alone, I don't want to be part of a medical experiment. They, with the advisor training, invariably have the biggest breakthroughs, because that response is fear-based, and being able to navigate beyond the fear, it's wonderful to see what then materializes, especially for the client, but then also for the advisor to be part of that process.
Definitely. You mentioned this term earlier, force multiplier, and the multiplier effect that I see there is not just about expanding the advisor's comfort zone to go to a vulnerable place where we're talking about stuff we're afraid of and then providing the solution there. And that's what the training would give you. But also to deal with the complexities of a life that is now, oh, you mean it's not as simple as I make it to this point and the game is over and I wait in my existence for the end. But the other force multiplier I hear every day when I'm meeting with clients is the impact on the middle generation. So if you have the G1, let's call it, which is the older generation in a state of excitement and joy and purpose and enthusiasm about their life, then that middle generation is not only going to get the example laid for them that that's what it looks like, which would be marvelous, but they're also not going to sit there for that same last 30 or 40 years of their parents' life wondering if this is it, and living in that state of kind of a comorbid thought about waiting for the end. And there's a total shift in the way that humanity would really experience that second half if it was laid out by an example for us.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, that touches into what I'm sort of now working on. I call the 3 revolutions. The revolution of longevity, what does it mean to successfully age? Revolution of AI, and so are you consuming or being consumed? And so the third revolution is the revolution of relationships, humanity, consciousness, depending on where you sit. But ultimately, it's more about being human beings rather than human doings. And you've touched on something very important that's sort of beginning to bubble up. I've had situations where advisors have clients 70 years old whose parents are still alive. I've had 20-year-olds come to me saying, wow, this is insanely interesting. We need a more uplifting message. And so when you look at the challenges within the industry at large, the financial professional industry, the organic growth, knock the cover off the ball there. The wealth transfer, 70% of assets leave either with the first spouse dying or both. Well, suddenly you've got multi-generational relationships that you can develop. And, that taboo idea of, well, we don't talk finance. Well, in actual fact, yes, you can, but let us show you how we can do that. So by helping the advisors navigate in there, when, I've had a financial planner say to me, I'm having conversations with my wife of 40 years I've never had before. So again, another challenge in the industry is in getting women more engaged. Well, guess what? If you're not talking Monte Carlo simulation, you've just increased your odds significantly.
Yeah. And the word you use, taboo, I think that is the issue, right? Because discussing money across generations, originally taboo, but the healthier families figure out how to do it, and they probably have either someone in their midst who's really good at that, or they have a great advisor who knows how to safely tiptoe into that space with them. I would say that this is a very similarly, potentially third rail subject where you're talking about what life looks like after 50 or 60 or 70, but why shouldn't it be discussed? And this actually brings up something I didn't even mention I was going to ask you about. But since I first chatted with you, I've started to contemplate this idea of an index or a scorecard or something that I don't know, these wearables like Whoop, you give you biometric feedback. I mean, what if I had something that I did my whole life that was a way of checking in that allowed me to decide, you know what, I'm not scoring well enough on these 5 areas. It's probably time for me to go down to 1 car. It's probably time for me to hire somebody to help with the garden. It's probably some time for, rather than being told by your kids that you need to do these things, to have some kind of metric or feedback thing that gives you this guidance. And maybe that's a nice place for technology and AI to fit into this with us at some point. But rather than your kid telling you, something that you are in ownership of that gives you the guidance that, you know what, it's awesome that you've got purpose, but you shouldn't be standing on the chair to change the light bulb anymore. That's Joe Coughlin's light. Who's going to change your light bulb, right? So I wondered do you see there being a possibility of G1 taking ownership of their own decisions because we're not looking at this as negative, we're looking at this as designed and elective?
This is brilliant. So, and the reason you're getting this reaction from me is, I'm just making this stuff up as I go along. But if you pay attention, what are people saying back to you? So I went from the original workshops focusing on 4 pillars, and that became 6. I've mentioned the mindset, physical health, metabolic health, etc. But then I started talking about scoring it. And someone said, yeah, you should have a scorecard. So guess what? Great news. We have the Flourishing Longevity Scorecard. So they recorded me at the FSU College of Medicine earlier this year at the Alzheimer's educational conference I was keynote to. So, we've got a little program put together where the clients, in essence, can watch the presentation, so that shifts the mindset, and then go take the Flourishing Longevity Scorecard. And I've been working, it's actually out of the UK, and I was working with the founder, sort of putting a PDF report together. He's 26, and he said to me, Jonathan, I think my friends and I would like to be able to take this every month. So not just, our generation. I mean, again, this is multi-whatever linear. It's so fascinating as this thing keeps bubbling up because you mentioned Joe Coughlin. I keep getting these bolts from the blue. So yeah, you've got those 3 questions. The first one, how long are you going to be able to change your light bulbs for? And of course, the intent there is, do you actually have the right sort of supports around you? However, when you stop and think about it, and you hear conversations about aging in place, and I don't want to have to move out, things like that, well, the question becomes, how do you, it's in the Flourishing Longevity Scorecard about, well, do you practice flexibility? Do you practice balance?
Right.
Are we asking the right question? Should the question actually be, for how long are you going to be able to change your light bulbs? Because one of the biggest fears of aging is having a fall and what it looks like afterwards. And again, there's 2 different stories depending on what's going on in your mind. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, can you balance on 1 foot for 30 seconds? Well, most of us, and again, over 65, you kind of give up on everything sort of thing, or many do. I mean, that's sort of been the default. So by bringing this Flourishing Longevity Scorecard in, you're creating that sort of framework, which you can then have your wearables and other things to sort of add to it. But that becomes the fascination. The second question that they ask, who's going to take you to get an ice cream cone? Well, hang on a minute. If 12.4 years of chronic illness is the average in the US, who would vote for that? And what are you going to do to reduce that number? So aligned to that, 90% of chronic illness is metabolic health or unhealth. So is taking someone to go and get them a ice cream cone actually good for them? Is that helping their aging process?
Should we be asking a different question? Well, who's going to take you for a smoothie? I don't know.
There you go. Well, there you go. Fair point. But the point being of always challenging. And I think one of my fun points of reference, and I use it in the presentation, is Sir Paul McCartney, who in the 60s was singing about fear and frailty. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Well, go look online and see what he's up to now. And he turned 80 a couple of years ago, 4-hour concert, and that wasn't good enough for him. So now he's doing a world tour. And you can see, they've got on YouTube the whole concert in some places. He's in North America right now. So in terms of breaking the scar tissue, this legacy we just didn't know, like my grandmother. She did not know any better than to think she is beyond her sell-by date, beyond 65, because that's what they told her in 1935.
That's right. And when we can instead envision, let's call it reverse engineering from the desired end state, those 26-year-olds you're talking about who are saying, I want to take this scorecard every year, what that encourages us to do from a very young age is invest our life force evenly, right? Instead of all into my family or all into my career and letting my health go to crap and not worrying about my finances and then one day waking up and having to, have a come to Jesus moment and fix things. Instead, we're laying a groundwork for a balanced, flourishing existence from the beginning. So going back to your discussion about the guy who was 103 and you're like, how do I get to there? What's the desired end state that we should be reverse engineering from? I think, and that might be a personal question for every person, but I mean, a great desired end state, not the end state of what we all see, which is the 12 point whatever years of chronic illness. May I ask you, what's your desired end state that you're reverse engineering from? And maybe by the time you answer, I'll have mine.
Well, so this is, one of the neat things. Andrew J. Scott in the Longevity Imperative that came out a couple of years ago, he's a professor at the London School of Economics. And he maps in, we've had the first revolution of longevity, which is longer lives. Now we need the second, which is how to live them successfully. So with that, he actually frames it, be ready to redefine what it means to be human. And, that's been swirling around me for 18 months, and I'm no closer to coming up. Well, what does that mean? But again, that flows into AI, consume or not, consuming or being consumed, human being, not human doing.
Doing, yes.
So it's putting all of these things together and allowing them to evolve. Now, one thing I do know is Jonathan consuming the amount of sugar that he has traditionally consumed probably isn't a good thing. So, things like metabolic function, intermittent fasting, and again, I am not a doctor, and what suits one person may not suit someone else, but things like autophagy, when you go and start looking at that, and, cell replacement, okay, so I could be doing this and getting that. Okay, well, this makes sense to me. So I think that end, you think of Steve Covey, begin with the end in mind. The idea of not using a walking stick and not taking medication is a good starting point.
Right.
Now, what's happened in between now and then? That, again, I'm just going to keep pulling on this thread. Warren Buffett, I think, still turns up for work in his 90s. I mean, there are plenty still out there. Yeah. And again, how intentional has he been?
Yes.
That's, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me, while I'm just on this roll, because a lot of advisors love to dive into the rabbit hole of numbers. So you hear people saying, oh, well, look, life expectancy just went down over the last couple of years. Yes, generally because of suicide and things like that. However, go do a search using your best friend called AI and say, how many people born in the US in 1950 were still alive at the census in 2020, e.g. age 70? Answer, 77%. Life expectancy in 1950 was 67. So the expectation would have been for somewhere just below 60% to still be alive. Yet, again, the reality was 77%, and a lot of them were guys. So again, this, again, nothing set in stone here. So this whole thing is already occurring at the margin. The first boomer only turns 80 next year. So, my dad used to say, averages hide more than they reveal. I think complacency, we've got to be really careful of making assumptions along the lines of, well, here's your life expectancy. We just don't know because, again, intentional aging has not been tried.
Yes, you're right. And I'm actually going to bring up something that I came up with a few years ago. It sits on the wall behind me. I don't know if you can see it, but I have those drawings there. That a few years back when I was doing some artistic brainstorming about where to go with the discussion with my clients in order to elevate the client experience, I came up with the idea that people fall into one of three buckets. It's like some Instagram questionnaire that you might do, whether you're a muffin, a bird, or a giraffe or whatever. But in my world, it was people are either builders or Jedis or athletes. They are either the Warren Buffett who still wants to put on a suit and pick up a suitcase or a briefcase and go to work every day. They are a creator, a Jedi, somebody who needs to engage with humanity, but also bring out the beauty in the world and somehow show it back, or they are the athlete. They are the one that wants to hike up Kilimanjaro, or they want to do something extraordinary every single year for the rest of their lives. If you had to identify yourself, would you be a builder, a Jedi, or an athlete? Because I think that might be an interesting starting point for reverse engineering from the end state. If I said to myself, you know what, I'm actually an athlete, and I need to physically do things in order to feel alive.
Okay, so this is because I don't have an answer to that question, so I'm going to fudge it by
spin
pushing
for a
back.
second. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I was in a workshop, and this goes back to natural essence. Just because you've been programmed to do something for 40 years and may appear, gosh, you're really good at that, doesn't mean to say you find it actually fulfilling. And I was in a workshop a few years ago, and they said, who here used to enjoy singing, dancing, who here enjoys singing, dancing, writing, whatever, painting? And, everyone's sort of sinking into their seat. And the presenter said, when you were 4 years old, you loved doing all of that because no one had told you weren't any good at it.
So true. That is true. We do end up taking on that judgment and pushing that person away.
And one other thing, different workshop, started with you having to say, I am wonderful, you are wonderful. Again, you're talking to a Brit here, so again, feelings overflowing.
That doesn't come naturally.
As we do. So again, sort of shrinking. And then it was pointed out, same principle, the 4-year-old was full of wonder. We are wonderful,
yes.
But how much do we lose it?
So true. And I call that the superpower of all superpowers so many times, curiosity, which is the ability to take wonder or be curious or inquire about things constantly. And that literally in the brain, neurochemically, that is the gold right there, because that means you're engaged. That means you're connecting. That means you're still alive. Okay, I love that.
And it flows into, again, I'm just thinking as you're saying that, this idea of lifetime learning. So that needs a motor. Well, being full of wonder leads to lifetime learning.
Spectacular. Thank you very much. That is brilliant. I have one question to finish with, which I ask and I've been asking you a lot of the off-script questions, but this is one that I hope you are prepared for.
Uh-oh.
I've been asking this of all of my podcast guests, and it's something that I call the moment of bliss. If you think of it as the inverse of a pet peeve, where a pet peeve is something that is very, very small, but it annoys you greatly, this would be something that is very, very small, but it gives you immense joy. Is there something in your day that you either notice or seek that is your moment of bliss, Jonathan Ainsley?
Yeah, again, coming from the British perspective and, that straitjacket we were all put in, I now go walking. Just close to me here is this park, and just walking, being present in nature. It's incredible to, again, keyword present. And then finding gratitude, again, just the simplicity. We can look so hard in life. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a rant here, but in the 80s, I actually worked in the North Sea on both diving boats and then on one of the oil rigs. And so it's 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And we get taken out on the rig, and the guys would go, couldn't wait to get back. It was murder at home, couldn't wait to be here. And there I am, 20 Lodderlock, going, okay, tell me it gets better than this, epoxy piece of metal in the middle of the North Sea. But lesson, who is the happier? The person who finds their lot in life, no matter what it is, or the one who's always seeking more? And so the lesson was, and I used to say this to advisors, you're so busy looking out the windscreen. Are you looking out of the side window and enjoying the journey? And I think, again, all too often, we don't do a good enough job, to enjoy, in this case, nature around us, but then also to acknowledge self. It's always fun when people say, I just did this. And I'll say, and how do you feel about that? Have you acknowledged you? Have you celebrated you? Because invariably the answer is no.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant.
So, long answer. I apologize.
No, it was a brilliant answer. And you have taken us one step further along our own journey to designing instead of defaulting, to being instead of doing. Thank you, Jonathan Ainsley. I wish you the most wonderful day.
You too. Thank you for this, Gillian. It's been marvelous. Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah, look forward to it.